What's going on, everybody? Mortem here. This time we are talking about Solasta, Crown of the Magister, and a review after 100%. So, just to get a couple things out of the way, for starters, I like to review games after I 100% them, just to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. But more specifically, I also feel like it lends some credibility to what I do. And moreover, in terms of spoilers for this particular title, I'll be covering like a plot setup, but not really the story in any great depth, and this game is a game that primarily focuses on the tabletop style combat of D&D, so spoilers shouldn't be a huge deal here, but just kind of, keep your ears out, I guess. So Solasta is a tactical turn-based CRPG with a big focus on combat. Basically what this game aimed to do was bring tabletop D&D into an actual video game in as true a sense as possible. And in that regard, I have to say they pretty much nailed it. Now, the system is based on D&D, but it's not entirely D&D by any means. It is the SRD rule set, which includes most of what D&D is, but not like every single thing. And because of that, they've filled in a lot of this stuff with homebrew, so the clerics won't be praying to gods that you actually have heard of through D&D, for instance. But with that out of the way, let's knock out my normal format here. So, the story setup. Basically, there was a rift some time ago that wiped out this ancient empire and kind of devastated the world in an event called the Cataclysm. Now, this led to an area called the Badlands, and recently, a council of competing nations was set up called the Legacy Council. It's their job to basically oversee the exploration of the Badlands, ideally in a way that benefits each nation. Now, because of this, they are hiring adventurers to go and explore the Badlands, which is where your party gets started. Now, the rest of the plot setup is that you find the crown of the Magisters, and the story kind of goes from there. Now, I do want to say a few things about the story very broadly, and that is that it's pretty linear, and overall it's super basic. There are some choices presented to you here and there that affect tiny minor things. That's about it. Like, for instance, very early in the game, before you even find the crown, actually, you'll potentially have the options to save one of a few different people. Well, two of a few different people. And depending on who you save, it can affect quests later on in the game. But just in like super minor ways. For instance, you might have the option of going to talk to that person who might know something about it. But the quest still resolves the same way. It just lets you skip a step, basically. Now, I will say the story does pick up towards the end a lot. I actually enjoyed the ending, because it went from kind of bland to this super interesting intrigue thing that I thought was a nice touch. But beyond that, let's get into the rest of it. So difficulty in this game comes in like story, explorer, normal, hard, and cataclysm. Cataclysm is definitely pretty challenging, but as you can see as you flip through the modes here, you can see exactly what each of these modes is actually adjusting. And what that is the actual damage your enemies are doing, period, as well as their health, plus the modifiers for the damage, attack, and saving throw rolls of either you or your enemies, depending on the difficulty setting. So at Cataclysm, enemies will have double health, and they'll get a +3 to all of their rolls. With that said, basically this game is going to be as hard as you choose to make it. It doesn't have to be difficult, but if you want more of a challenge, crank it up. In my opinion, at the higher difficulties, the increased health of monsters is really more of a challenge than anything else, because all of the rolls can be mitigated through better armor, etc. Now, when we're talking about difficulty, I do want to mention that this game has an exceptional tutorial, especially for a CRPG. So CRPGs tend to be based on complex tabletop systems and then bother to barely explain it, whereas Solasta, and I think this is largely because of its focus on the combat, seems to have gone the opposite direction, where they go through this tutorial where your characters meet in an inn, which is classic D&D, and they each tell a story of some trouble along the way that they had getting there. And that serves as a tutorial for kind of each situation, be it sneaking, disengage, shove actions, bonus actions, attacking, defense, that kind of stuff, even how to rest. So in a genre where they typically don't do a particularly good job of explaining these things, I think Solasta does it really well, and it's worth mentioning. But let's move on. Let's talk about character creation. There are pre-generated characters you can use if you don't feel like making them, or you can create your own. But in total, you will have 4 characters that you have to either make or pick right at the start of the game. Now, there is not one set protagonist for this game. That's just not how D&D works, so it's not how Solasta works. Now, there are 6 classes. You can choose backgrounds, ability scores, proficiencies, languages, kind of all depending on the class you pick. So kind of just standard D&D stuff, really. Now, when it comes to the ability scores, there is a point buy as well as a dice roll system, so kind of whichever you prefer there. The 6 classes are Fighter, Cleric, Wizard, ranger, paladin, and rogue. Those are all pretty well established archetypes, so I don't feel the need to explain them by any means. But I do want to mention the backgrounds you can select at character creation, because this is important. There's 8 of them, and each of them has its own unique side quest that kind of deals with that character's background in the game. Because where most of the story is linear, the background side quests are actually fairly unique, and I liked them a lot. So just keep that in mind when you're picking your character. And so that brings us to the world building. So with that in mind, let's start with the actual world map. It is a fairly basic system, just a map. You click where you want to go. It'll explain travel times to you because that's how D&D works. You have to have rations or another way to provide your party with food, say with the Goodberry spell as you travel. You have to take fatigue into account, but if you always travel at normal speed, then it's fine. And you'll be able to explore locations. Now, you can't really explore anywhere outside of what you don't already know. So there's no way to explore different parts of the map. You just kind of have to know where stuff is through side quests and things, or the main quest, and that's really the only way to go somewhere new. So overall, the world map, pretty basic, but it serves its purpose, so no real complaints there. Now, I do want to mention that there is a lot of lore just kind of laying around these areas where you can find lost notes and stuff, or your characters might roll arcana checks and stuff about the past to tell you things about the Empire that used to inhabit the Badlands. So just kind of a lot of lore kind of in and around. So if you like that kind of thing, that's always nice. Kind of makes it feel like a D&D module really in that way. Now, I do want to mention the other way this kind of focuses on world building is that when you're exploring certain areas, you can find what are called faction relics, which are relics that you can go back to the main town and then give to a specific faction. Now, 2 of the factions are tied to the main story and you can't do this with, but the other 4 you can turn these relics into and they all serve as vendors. Now, it's hard to actually put any of these factions into negative points, but that said, you can't really max all of them out either. And depending on your conversation options and stuff in council meetings, it can affect different factions to a different amount. But while its primary function is to just serve as vendors of various types of merchandise, I do enjoy that they kind of tried to put in this council dynamic of these factions vying for power with each other in the game nonetheless. I thought that was a nice touch. But that's about all there is to say about the world building, really. It's kind of this standard D&D high fantasy type stuff. So, if you've ever played a fantasy title, you'll pretty much get the gist. Dwarves, elves, that kind of thing. But nonetheless, they at least attempted to bring this world to life in a game that is almost entirely focused on combat, so I appreciate that nonetheless. So with that said, let's talk about combat. This is very, very rules as written style D&D. They don't do things because it makes more sense for a video game or it feels better. They try as closely as possible to stick to the tabletop rule set, and in that regard, they did it very well. This very much so feels like Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, with their homebrew stuff mixed in, mind you. Now, your experience in combat is going to differ based on a few things, simply knowledge of D&D, the classes you picked for your party, and how well those mix together. But something very specifically that I wanted to talk about in terms of this turn-based tactical system is that this isn't just a 2D grid that your characters are working on here. Something I actually noticed while playing is that this is actually like a 3D cube grid, more so than it is an actual 2D grid. So what I mean by that is that it's very possible for enemies as well as your characters, if you have the right items, to climb on walls and things, and then when you are activating your spells, say through a wizard, some of them are very much so cube shaped in effect, and you can kind of see that take place. Just keep in mind while you're participating in combat that the combat grid that your characters are working on is really more of an actual 3D space, and I thought that was a really cool touch, because they did that part very well. And it's subtle, so you might not necessarily notice it, because it doesn't literally show the 3D cubes, but that's definitely what it is. So with that in mind, let's move on to companions and stuff. Now, there aren't really any companions, however, throughout the main story, you will be tasked with escorting what are called critical characters. Critical characters, basically if they die, it's game over. They're critical to the story. But they are usually decently effective and have their own turns and stuff in combat where they can assist you. Now, none of these guys are super fleshed out. None of them are that amazing combat-wise, but they're as close as you're going to get to actual companions outside of your main 4 parties, so I just wanted to mention them here nonetheless. So let's talk positives, negatives, and then kind of sum this up. So the positives of this is that it's that faithful adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons combat that they just nailed. They really did a good job with that. They did a fantastic job with the tutorials. And I also want to mention, I don't know who their UI designer was, but whoever that was deserves a raise, because this is a fantastic UI. I actually really enjoy this. It isn't in your face. It's actually pretty simple as far as this stuff goes, but everything I thought of to look for was there. There's even a lot of convenient stuff that as you play around with it, you'll find. This is just a very good UI, and I think it's worth mentioning. Now, the negatives of the game to me are this. So while this is very faithful to Dungeons and Dragons combat, it's not very faithful to Dungeons and Dragons gameplay. And that is to say that there is a very narrow story, filled with a few choices here and there, and like, can you talk your way out of this situation? But that will never not lead to the exact same outcome as far as that quest goes. Like, sure, you can approach your way to it, maybe talk your way out of a fight or something, but the end result of that quest is going to be the same, which just makes the choices feel kind of pointless, and the story is very much so on rails. Which I get it, honestly, with all the focus that went into combat, it makes sense to me that this game wouldn't necessarily have all the trappings of like a choice-based RPG. But nonetheless, this is a Dungeons and Dragons game, and there's just not a lot of choices to be made as far as the story goes. So to draw a conclusion from all of those things, it's simply this. This is for $40 on Steam right now. A fantastic choice if you're really into the Dungeons and Dragons tabletop gameplay. But frankly, if you're looking for a great story experience, while I do think the story is decent, and I'll probably cover it at some point, it's not going to blow you away. There's not a lot of choices to be made because the choices are more about how you build your characters and how you approach combat, because that's where the focus of the game is. If you really love Dungeons and Dragons and you have $40 laying around, this is a fantastic outing into the combat, and I sincerely hope this game does well because I'd like to see what this group of developers, Tactical Adventures, does in the future. With that out of the way, guys, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.